We just listened to the president speak. We heard also some of the Republican leaders and their take on the meeting. It sounds like they all sat around, held hands, and sang Kumbaya. You know, it was a great meeting. But then they said, we still got to find some common ground.
Right. It's hard to read this meeting and what actually happened, you know, in these initial remarks. We had the president say it was a good meeting, but then we heard Mitch McConnell say it was a frank exchange. We know that coded language means that both sides put forward their positions. And when they came out, even though they said it was civil, they still remain where they stood before. And particularly on this tax cut, Republicans are unified, as Mitch McConnell said. 100% of Republican senators do not want to see any tax increases on the upper income. They've got to go, the tax cuts have got to be extended for everybody at the same time. The president has a different view. So, as you say, it was nice and pleasant in the room, but there's so far been no actual movement on those two key positions.
Now, the president said in his remarks after the meeting that he's asking his Treasury Secretary and Budget Director to try to break this impasse, and it sounds like he's sweetening the pot a little bit, throwing out the idea of maybe some tuition breaks, tax breaks for college tuition. Is that going to make a difference at all?
Well, he's got two different sets of things. There's the what happens to marginal rates for everybody, and then there are these other tax cuts that are going to expire and tax troubles too. So he's got it's a big playing field, and plus, as he mentioned, also there's the extension of unemployment insurance, which is a spending program which Republicans are for, but again, in this negotiation, it might get thrown into a tax deal.
But another thing, obviously, and they said that they talked about in the meeting, was something the president has really made a national security foreign policy priority, and that is getting the START treaty passed. We saw McConnell come out after the meeting say no go on that until we do taxes and tax cuts. I mean, is the tax issue going to just bog down everything?
Well, that's the thing. It was interesting. The president mentioned START, and McConnell basically didn't mention it at all. He said we got to get these other things done first, and that's the Republican line.
And he said they're unified. I mean, you said unanimity. There's unanimity that we're not going anywhere until we resolve the taxes.
Right, and the Republicans have said, and we heard John Kyle, the point man on this, say this, which is that the Democrats want to do all these other things, and there just isn't time before the end of the year. And it looks like that this tax thing is going to be a big block in the way, and it's just going to eat up the days. And Republicans will say at the end of it, look, haven't had enough time to talk about this. You saw the president try and answer that, do a little pre-buttal by saying, well, there have been 18 different hearings. There's support from Republicans and Democrats on START, so we don't need a long process to discuss this. So again, another issue, another place in which both sides seem to have very opposing views.
You know, one of the things that, and this has been this long scheduled kind of meeting trying to get together, they couldn't figure out a date. Finally, they're having it after the November elections. And it sounded like the president was saying, you know, this was, as we've discussed, this was a civil meeting. We saw GOP Whip Cantor come out and say the president conceded that he hadn't reached out to Republicans enough, and, you know, he's going to be better. But then I thought the president's remarks that we heard when he just came out and spoke, almost like he's lecturing a little, that, you know, well, but, you know, we can't bring politics into this. And I think I heard that politics are not going to be a part. You know, we really got to kind of stay on the game here and remember that we're trying to work for the American people, that kind of thing.
Exactly.
Is that going to annoy some of the Republicans that he just sat down with?
Well, the president
I think he said, and I wrote it down, he said, you know, we'll have plenty of time for campaigning.
Sure, and he started out by saying this: the voters did not vote for gridlock. Okay, so there's a debate about what the election was about. The president says this wasn't a vote for gridlock. Republicans say the election was a repudiation of Democratic goals, and that the voters are voting for what we voted for. So yes, there was spin going into the meeting to prepare the ground, and now coming out of it, the president is saying, well, this is all about making a deal, and that's what the voters told us. And what Republicans are saying is this is all about jobs, and we're the protectors of that. And so while the president ended it by saying, you know, we all in the room agreed that we wouldn't go into the normal spin cycle, the normal spin cycle is in full movement at the moment. And this is just now a few minutes after the meeting is concluded. So you expect by the end of today, who knows what they'll be calling each other.
Well, you know, you've covered, I mean, obviously you've been around covering politics here for quite a while, and you've seen a lot of these meetings. I mean, typically the president gets a little bump up, I think, in public opinion. But I mean, really, what's the point of this? I mean, like you said, then the dog and pony show after, where you've got, you know, both sides coming to run out to the cameras within minutes.
This was kind of the first meeting you had to have to get to those next meetings. The important ones are the meetings with the president's budget director, his Treasury Secretary, and the congressional leaders to actually hammer out the tax deal. And what we'll see in those meetings is what the shape of a deal is, if a deal can happen. So this meeting meeting had to happen, everybody had to get in the same room and kind of go through this ceremony, but now the actual hard work begins. And how each side behaves in that meeting will be really the test of whether there's any kind of new tone at all, or whether Republicans stick to basically their position, which is they don't want tax cuts of any kind to increase, and whether the White House sticks with their position, which is that they only want the tax cuts for the middle class. I mean, it's basically who's going to blink first.
And what's your prediction?
I think the president actually is going to blink first. They've already given signs here that he's basically going to extend all cuts probably for a limited period of time, and then tie that probably to some kind of more comprehensive tax reform. Remember that, as you know, we're about to have a huge, massive discussion about tax cuts and spending after we get over this one. So this is the pre-fight before the titanic battle over the fact that we have a budget deficit that is way out of whack, and we have spending and tax policies that need to be reformed. So it's likely the shape of the deal will probably be some extension of cuts tied to a more adult, long-term conversation once we get into the new year.
And what does that do for the president in terms of his approval ratings, do you think, though, or even for his base, if it's seen that, you know, after these elections, these midterms, he comes in and now he's blinking? Is that he's listening to the voters, or is that he's now caving into Republicans who are in control?
The president, I think, the White House view is this. The president has to return to those principles people liked about him in 2008, which is that he's a bridge builder, a bipartisan consensus builder, and they need to be reminded of that guy. So the president has to try, and that's part of what we saw in his remarks today. If that fails, then he can have a big fight with the Republicans. But he needs to reintroduce people to that person, because polls show and the election show that people think the president got too far to the left. In doing that, the president will run into trouble with his progressive base. They want to fight immediately. And he'll have to work that tension, both with this tax cut deal that we'll have before the end of the year, and then also into next big discussion about the budget deficit.
And then in the meantime, I think we said this is the first in a series of these meetings. He said he might even have some at Camp David. So,
well, that'll be really interesting, is that if they spend the night together, you know, and really have to hang out with each other, that is sometimes where these problems melt away.
So they'll move from Slurpees, which this is kind of called the Slurpee Summit, right, to maybe something stiffer.
To after dinner drinks, perhaps, you know, and a late night viewing of The Big Sleep or some other movie.
All right. Well, John, thanks so much for joining us. We really appreciate your analysis and insight, as always. Thanks a lot. And finally, let's take a look at part one of Washington.